Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the McGill Dementia Education Program's Caring Conversations, another free initiative to provide virtual support to care partners of people living with dementia. This program is supported by Petro-Canada's Caremakers Foundation. So I'm Claire Webster. I'm the founder of the McGill University Dementia Education Program, and I'm so happy to be here today. And we have a large group of people who are joining us, which was really, really great. The topic is home care or care home. And before I introduce our moderators, we will just let you know that if you could please keep your microphones turned off, we will unmute people during the discussion period. So our moderators are Lucy Barylak. She's a social gerontology consultant for the CIUS West Central Montreal and is a graduate of the McGill University School of Social Work, where she's also a liaison supervisor. She's developed an evidence-based training for seniors and caregivers, and she lectures in the field of social gerontology and knowledge transfer. She's also known as Dear Lucy. She facilitates an online caregiver support show funded by the WellMed Foundation in the United States. And she was the founder and long-standing manager of the Caregiver Support Center at the CLSC René Cassin, a multi-service respite center for family and informal caregivers. Lucy received the Queen's Jubilee Award for her role in developing a national coalition to support caregivers across Canada. We will also have Joanne Besner. She's an educator, professional coach, and caregiver. She received her Bachelor of Social Work and Master of Business Administration from McGill University. Her 35-year career in public community health in Quebec spans many roles, including frontline case manager, clinical supervisor, manager, researcher, and trainer. She has experience in home care for adults experiencing loss of autonomy, caregiver services and support, admission to public nursing homes, research, and training. In 2019, she retired from public healthcare and today is a certified professional coach and workshop facilitator focusing on social services and healthcare. Joanne coaches professionals and creates interactive workshops for healthcare and community organizations, including the McGill University School of Social Work, where she's also a stage liaison supervisor. So today we'll be looking at how to recognize if or when it's time to transition to a supervised care home and coping with the feelings that accompany making that type of decision. I'd like to hand it now over to Lucy Barylak.
Thank you very much, Claire. Good morning and welcome to everybody. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you want to share or ask a question, please raise your hand using the hand icon and the reaction tab at the bottom of your computer screen. People participating by phone can raise your hand by dialing *9. You can also ask questions by typing them into the chat box, and Claire or Maria will read it out. So I hope that's clear. And if anyone has a question, that's fine too. So today our topic is home care or care home. Joanne and I will be doing our presentation first. You will then have lots of time to ask questions, make comments, and hopefully participate. So our agenda today, we are going to be talking about emotions, living at home with support, relocation choices, questions to ask yourself. Next slide, please. Okay, what I do want to share with you is many caregivers go through so many emotions throughout their caregiving journey, and it's so important to acknowledge your feelings. In my caregiving journey for my mother, the hardest time was when I realized that my mother's needs were not being met at home. I really felt overwhelmed by all the emotions that came over me. Could she stay at home with more services, or is care home the answer for her? I have to tell you that I felt so sad for my mother. I was very anxious if I was making the right decisions, angry at all of her losses. I realized that I needed to ask myself and my mother many unanswered questions before I could make that decision and do the right choice for her and as well for myself. So I guess what I want to say is that these kind of emotions run through all our caregiving journey, but in particular in this situation. So if you are feeling anxious or overwhelmed, let me tell you, You are certainly not alone. Next slide, please.
Lucy, thank you so much for that heartfelt introduction about your mom. So for us to have our caring conversations today, we need to start with information and knowledge. So we're not going to go into fine details because home care does vary across the provinces, and you, our audience, are from across Canada. But let's look at the big lines. So caring for someone with Alzheimer's varies. It can run from simply having to supervise your person to helping with all the activities throughout the day, all the way to total care. And you can see some of them listed on our slide. They could include giving hygiene, toileting, changing incontinence products, helping them eat, dress, undress, in bed, out of bed, giving medications, not to mention housekeeping and laundry. And emotions are constantly at play here because it may be that as you do every task, you may be anticipating the next task ahead. And the research does tell us that most people want to stay home as long as they possibly can. But it is not the only option, and sometimes not always the best option, depending on the circumstances and particularly the risk factors. Because we all have different desires and beliefs and values, thankfully today there are many different ways to live with dementia, and that's good and bad. So staying home or care home, that's why it can pose a huge dilemma. So to have the best chance of caring and success, if you're going to be caring at home, do not do it alone. Create a team around you. Look at home care supports. Now we know these vary according to province. Oops, that's my trigger finger. But you can access professional services at home, nurses, social workers, occupational and physiotherapists who can come in and look at the safety environment and how to walk and mobilize. There is help for some personal care at home as well. And home safety equipment. You can acquire equipment to make your bathroom and home safer, all the way to hospital beds. And of course, perhaps you could have respite care resources, a few hours in the home, or even in some provinces, you can acquire a few weeks outside the home. So there are these varying services available, but you do have to consider availability and wait lists. And also you might want to ask yourself the questions about how do you feel about having care resources in your home? Equipment and adaptations. Could you accept this with comfort, or do you feel resentful? How is it being vulnerable to other people's schedules, the no-shows? Sometimes help can be inconsistent. There's a change of personnel. And of course, you're going to have less privacy, little time off. So it's very, very important to tap into professionals, not only for the medical and the concrete help, but for support as well. We also want to encourage you to reach into your community for more partners. Take a look, your physician, your pharmacist today has as great a role as ever. There are hospital and rehab centers. Your geriatric team. Your geriatric team. In the different provinces, there are community organizations. In Quebec, we call them CLSCs. In Ontario, they're known as CCACs. And we imagine that in your province, you have an equal community organization. You can hire private care services to top off what you can get publicly. There are day centers, day programs, adapted transportation. Meals on Wheels can be delivered. There are Alzheimer's societies and caregiver support groups and educational resources, just like you're participating in today. The truth is, if it's your wish, and you have the financial means, the adequate space, the equipment, the professional support, the medical support, The caregiving strength and wherewithal to do this, and if you can minimize the risks, it is possible to stay at home for the duration. And this choice can be very gratifying, comfortable, and optimal for both you and your care receiver. However, this is not for everyone. It can be overwhelming. No one should feel or be forced to do this. It's for you to decide and for how long you can keep going. So what do other options look like? Do you ever find yourself wondering about how this caring can be done differently? Do I need something to change besides adding more help at home? So Lucy and I are always saying that knowledge gives power and a sense of control. So exploring this does not necessarily mean you're going to make a change, but it's very important to know what it could look like and when and if the time ever comes. Better to do so before you are in a time of crisis. So what would it be like to be a caregiver in a care home? You become part of a new community. Care is provided by others, along with activities and social stimulation. You can come and go as you please. You can let go of the 24/7 responsibility. But you also need to consider some other things, like the effort to travel there, how you might fit in. There are rules to follow, right? It's not your turf anymore. What's your role? What if you feel like the care isn't good enough? What if you disagree with the personnel? Who can you talk to? Who can you work with? So we're just going to take a look at some of the choices you might be facing. And to do this, we're going to look at the private side and then the public side. So private, if you're going that route, there are a wide variety to suit individual cultures, languages, lifestyles, locations, and sizes. There are small family type residences all the way to large apartment hotels with services and differing levels of care. There are retirement residences all the way to private nursing homes. You must look at, though, the terms, conditions, and menu of services in your lease. This is critical. If you're going the public route, there are also a variety of choices, various levels of care based on your person's care needs. Also, different cultures, locations, environments, and sizes as well. The service quality and norms are standardized, though, as per provincial standards of long-term care. So you have choices. What is the process? So again, the big lines, if you're going private, like any private purchase, you need to do the research, compare and visit. If you have a care team, a social worker, a case manager, you really have to include them in the decision. Benefit from a knowledgeable private placement counselor. This is our recommendation to you. There are counselors that are experts in this area. This is their work. They have all the information for you and expertise. You do not have to pay them. They are paid by the residences, and they can offer you knowledge. They do the legwork for you or with you. They can support you as well and even negotiate for you. So we really encourage this option. There's generally a resident assessment, and you need to understand the lease you sign and the implications for now, for the future, and if you ever have to cancel. Public is a more stringent application process. You'd also want to do the research. Generally, there's an application process with a medical evaluation and an assessment by a social worker. You make your first and second choice, and there are wait lists. When admission does come, it's generally very fast. You might have just 24 or 48 hours in some cases because they cannot afford to keep the bed empty. So again, there are a lot of choices, and you have to do your due diligence wherever you live and work with the experts around you. But two things that Lucy and I want to mention. You must have consent of the person. even if they are no longer act and can't legally consent, morally, it is really advised that something like this should be discussed, unless, of course, the risk factors of telling them are going to cause irreparable distress. So that you need to take that decision. And one other important point we want to mention regarding choosing between private and public. In dementia, 2 months ago, we had the session on BPSD, behaviors and psychological symptoms of dementia, like agitation, aggression, wandering. If your person suffers from BPSD, be very careful if you're going the private route. We do recommend public relocation where they have specialty units who can answer to their needs. So now comes the tough part, taking the decision. So there was a research tool created in 2013 in Quebec by Melanie Couture and Francine Ducharme in 2013. And although we can't provide you the tool, it has to be used with a professional, so you are able to access it. We find it very useful as a guided reflection tool. So Lucy and I have chosen about half of the questions, and we are proposing today just to do a short quiz together. So we want you to grab a pen and a paper, or you can simply take the time to think. And we've chosen 7 questions that we want you to think about so that you can get a little bit more insight into your individual situation. So for the quiz, I'm going to pass it back to you, Lucy.
Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to give you a little bit of time in between, just a few seconds to kind of reflect or write down. So the first question is, what is it about your current situation that makes it good for the person you are caring for to remain at home? The other one is, what is it about your situation that may be prompting you to consider a change of living environment for the person you are caring at home? How would you describe your ability to take care of the person you are caring for lately? Next slide, please. What is your perception of other potential living environments for the person you are caring for? How would you imagine your role as a caregiver if the person you are caring for moved to another living environment? When you consider the idea of a change of living environment for the person you are caring for, how do you feel? Now let's look at the last questions. It's about assumptions and promises. So how do the people around you, including the person you are caring for, feel about relocating? Joanne was asking, that's important for you to know. Were there any assumptions made over the years? Were promises made? Can these promises be kept? Is everyone on the same page? What if it's good for the person with dementia, but it's not good for you? What if they refuse? All those questions need to be taken into consideration. So in the reality, what is it that we really want, regardless of whether they stay at home or whether they are in a care home? And what it really is the quality of care is so important. Safety and security, that nobody is at risk, access to support and services, capacity and well-being of the caregiver, our wishes granted. So the thing is, whether, whatever it is that we wish for ourselves and for the person that we are caring for. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's, it's time. We asked all these questions. We did our little presentation and we want to give people the opportunity. So let's have a caring conversation, considering what is it about your situation that makes it hard for you to make such a decision, home care or care home. So the lines are open, the chats are open, and we're waiting anxiously for your questions or your comments.
Maybe I'm going to jump in as well, because I too had to make the difficult decision to place my mom because she had Alzheimer's and she was living alone. And I work with so many family members that are going through this situation, and we feel this tremendous guilt for having to make that decision. And I think everybody needs to know, like Lucy said at the beginning, like, you're not alone. And the reality is nobody wants to go to a care home. Like, that's not the reality. But what I see, which is very hard for family members, the ones that I work with, is, sometimes a parent or a spouse has made the family members swear that they would never ever place them. Otherwise, they could lose an inheritance, or that they would be ousted or something. And that puts a lot of pressure on family members as well. And I think what's most important is that people have to go back to the slides that Lucy and Joanne, those questions that you asked, because at the end of the day, are you able to provide the best quality of care and safety for that person? Not only for the person, but are you able to have a quality of life for yourself? Are you feeling safe? So these are all difficult emotions and decisions to make, but many of us have been there and have walked in your shoes.
Thank you, Claire. And we just want to remind everybody, if you want to share some of your thoughts, simply raise your hand and put it in the chat, and we'll be happy to hear from you.
Hi there, it's Diane. We have a question from Melissa. Melissa, would you like to go ahead, please?
Posting this today. So my mom is the one with dementia, and she has a very, very, very fast progressing dementia. She has the behavioral, the one you mentioned before, I forget what BPSD, I think you said. Yes, and it's been so fast, and I found her too young for this. But anyways, I guess my question is, so last Friday, we did make the difficult decision to place her in a home, and we started the process with a social worker at the CLSC, and we're, getting all the paperwork. They said it takes up to 3 months and that she's highest priority. And I don't know if this is something you can even answer, but do you feel like 3 months is accurate, or is it much faster? Is that a better question for the social worker? And I have so many questions. Do we find that the care homes treat our loved ones well?
Wow. So, Lucy, are you okay if I start this one off?
Absolutely.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for sharing, because you're very brave and you're our first sharer. And also, it's what you're describing is probably, it's the toughest situation with dementia, so quick, and with the behavioral difficulties. I can tell you that in the latter part of my career, I did work on the team for nursing home placement. So I can try to attempt a little bit of an answer. But what you said is most important, is to keep in touch with your social worker, because things change on a day-to-day basis depending on what your request is. A length of a waiting list is always the million-dollar question. Somehow it never seems to come at the perfect time. Sometimes it just can't come soon enough. And sometimes when it comes, everything is stable and you're thinking, oh my God, am I really going to do this? When you say 3 months for this kind of a specialized bed, my first inclination is to say that's probably a realistic wait. If a situation becomes critical and urgent, and you are at risk, or the person you're caring for is at risk at home, there is always an emergency placement available, even if it's in hospital. But if you try to do the waiting, I think that's probably the best guess she can give you, or he, and it's a guess. What I want to say about these specialized units are, it's very important to understand that dealing with these behaviors needs specialized training. I take my hat off to you, because caring for somebody at home takes incredible patience, knowledge, a whole host of skills and strength that, you know, are so difficult to source. So I hope you have support. Is there anything? Yes, Lucy, you look
Yes.
like you want to add something.
Well, what intrigued me was your question when you kind of were saying, how will my mother be treated and in placement? And that's one of the things that I was always worried about as well. You know, it's interesting because your caregiving role doesn't change for many people. I mean, there's a choice there, obviously, of being a caregiver. And one of the things that once the person is placed, many caregivers, including myself at the time, was an advocate. I wanted to know how my mother is being treated. So, you know, so if you go the private route, it's always good to observe how other people are being treated and being involved and visiting and really being part of that. But these are all questions that most of us think about, that emotional part. How will my parent or my husband or my wife or my partner be treated?
Thank you.
So we have a question in the chat. Could you please elaborate on the situation where the person suffering from memory loss is very resistant to a move because from their perspective, they are still totally fine and doing everything they used to do, especially in light of the statement made that we need to get their agreement and consent?
Okay, I'll take the first stab at this one. This is such a common situation, because the truth is, how can we expect someone with dementia and who doesn't remember that they have all these losses to agree to do something that they just is not what they want, and they may not really understand why they need to do this. Sometimes the hardest thing, and I've been through this myself personally, and your workers may tell you, we can't force a person if there is not enough risk evident. We want to try to build relationships. You try to introduce your social workers, try to talk about the subject, gently reintroducing it. But sometimes when that doesn't work, we unfortunately have to wait for a crisis to happen. So sometimes that can be something simple like a UTI, an infection that brings someone into hospital. But sometimes, and I know we went through this with my former mother-in-law, who had dementia, completely resistant to relocate. And we were praying that when the crisis came, it wasn't life-threatening or horribly serious. And that's exactly what happened. She had a fall, and only then were we able to make the move. And I know this is a horrible, hard thing to hear. And Lucy, maybe you'll elaborate a little bit on working through it, but working through it, having the discussions, you do that to the best of your ability. And sometimes we're not as successful as we hope to be. Did you want to add something, Lucy?
Well, there is no magic formula to that. I think it really boils down to the risk factors, and to keep to have a case manager at hand. When I talk about risk factors, if this person, it depends on, do they have good judgment or not? For example, if they keep putting on cooking and they're putting the house possibly on fire, these are all risk factors that you really need to be able to look at and to be able to, to work through, as Joanne said. So it's really important and many times I know for myself, I did take my mom to a place to show her. And interestingly enough, she was very intrigued by the fact that there were other people sitting around. And I came at a time when there was a music session going on, and she wanted to participate. So it takes all kinds of different ways. You know your person better than anybody else. And maybe taking them and showing them could be an opening.
Thanks, Lucy. I think Claire wanted to add something.
Yeah, I think what's really important also for everyone to know is that dementia causes another illness called anosognosia. Okay, so anosognosia is the person's inability to think logically or to reason. So it happens in many, many cases where the person that has dementia, they think they're fine, they think there's nothing wrong with them, but in fact there is, right? And so it is even more important that people make sure that they get an assessment by a doctor. A lot of people say, why bother getting an assessment? There's no cure to dementia. But here's a perfect example of how important it is, because if you feel and you realize it's time to transition, the social worker is going to need an assessment from the doctor. Okay, if you're going to be in a position where you're going to have to, put forth a mandate or make those decisions on behalf of your loved one, you need that doctor's assessment. Okay, and the doctor will also help guide you and make you realize about this anosognosia. So, please, so many people that I work with, family say, well, why bother? Why bother? It is so imperative to go and get a proper assessment done.
Thank you, Claire. I think I'd like to piggyback on what you said about the importance of your care team and getting the assessments. We talk about risk factors. Remember, there's the risk factors to you, the caregivers, as well. How are you doing and feeling? And if your health is failing physically or emotionally, this is a time to help engage your care team too. So if it means on the next visit to your family doctor or geriatrician, help them talk to the person you're caring for. If you do end up in hospital, that's also an opportunity for the care team to come in and make recommendations and really assess what is the balance here. Is home still the best option? And sometimes the person we're caring for will react differently to something that we say as a caregiver versus to what someone else says, either a family member or a professional. But again, no magic solution. This is the toughest challenge.
See that Danielle has a question. Danielle, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. My mom, she's 94. She has dementia, and she lives with me since, I guess, 2020. I see changes in the way she is, more incontinence, more question like, what should I do next? And I'm wondering, when do I contact the social worker? I have already. I'm in Quebec, so I have soins à domicile. They are with me in that, but they always talk about social worker. But when will it be the time to discuss with a social worker? Because I feel my brother and sister, they look at me a strange way because I still want to keep my mother with me because she's happy, she's secure. The house is secure for her. So I'm wondering, do I keep her home for me or for her?
That's Danielle, that's a very insightful question that you're asking. And I think that's the balancing act. Do I keep her at home for me or for her? I think, first of all, the social worker should be involved as soon as possible, and to have a really good assessment done at home. You're saying she's 94, she's becoming, she's more confused, there's incontinence. There's a lot of reasons for the social worker to know. And the thing is that, and for you to also be aware of all the services that are available to you. And the thing is as long as you feel that you're able to maintain your mother at home with no risk, and it's very important what Joanne also said, you have to think about yourself as well. As long as it's not intruding on your own life, that you could still do things, you could still socialize, not have to isolate yourself. The other thing is, can she be left alone? So these are all the kind of things that you could discuss with a social worker, and a good assessment at home would be very, very valuable to you. So I say call her as soon as you get off the phone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good
Thanks,
luck,
Lucy.
Danielle.
Thank you.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. So here's the first question. Is there a better way for us to prepare my mom to go into a home? Do we say something or not say anything to her about a home? Is it better to say she's going for a drive and leave her? This is hard.
Oh, you know what? I'll tackle this one first. And Lucy and I were talking about this one. Because the one thing I recall so vividly, this question that you're asking is on so many people's mind. And yes, I've heard families say, please, can I just take them and tell them we're going for lunch, and then have lunch and, and then go through the process. They won't remember. It's very hard for Lucy and I or anyone to answer that question for you. And I would venture to say, if you don't know the answer now, and as our previous caller asked, talk about it with your social worker. You can broach the subject a bit with the person you're taking care of. I mean, we believe, everyone has the right to know. So you can start by even visiting someone. Is there someone else that you can take them to visit, and just open the conversation in an indirect way, not necessarily about them, but about a friend of theirs or a relative of theirs is one way. We never advocate tricking a person ever, but only you know your person. There are so many factors involved, from personality to the degree of the dimension that they're suffering to their memory. So talking it over, knowing your person, talking it over with family members and professionals is really the only way to decide.
I'll just quickly tell you that I did have a caregiver that had the same issue. And I had suggested maybe that the mom could go to a day center just to see how they enjoy, or how they like being together with other people. And it worked very well. And that was a transition period somehow. So any transition that you feel that would be beneficial, try it out.
Lucy, you're reminding me also, there is in some provinces temporary respite care available. So before you make a permanent move to a nursing home, I've had clients as well who have had their person have a short stay, 4 or 5 days or a week, just to see how do they do in that environment. Of course, it's not always possible if you can't get them to agree to go for the short stay, but I love what you said, Lucy, about transitioning.
Can I jump in also and say, because since I had to go through this myself, and it was definitely against my mother's wishes that I had to transition her, but at some point when there's no choice, it really comes down to also tough love. I knew that I had to do this for her safety, for her well-being, but also for my own well-being. I mean, when we're representing the sandwich generation and you're caring for young children and you're trying to have a career, and it just became impossible for me to keep going back and forth and back and forth. And I think, as Danielle mentioned earlier, sometimes we don't want to move ahead with these things because we're so afraid at the reaction that this person may have. But sometimes the longer you wait, the harder it could become. What I also think is very important is, when you do decide to make that decision, be sure that you're working, or you're transitioning the person to a facility that they're used to people who are arriving wanting to go home immediately, because it takes time for the person to adapt. So be sure that the staff are trained, that the staff are going to be able to reassure and try to comfort your loved one, or the person that you're caring for, because it's going to be normal that once they arrive, they're going to ask to go back home. So you really want to work with the team over there.
Thanks, Claire. We do have another question in the chat. What happens when there's a lack of services for the English-speaking populations in care home? The cognitive memory has declined and native language spoken is English. So how can we get service with elders if the staff at the care homes are not able to communicate?
Oof. Yeah, that's a tough one, a very, very realistic one today. Generally, I'm going to say the should word, but you should be able to be serviced in the language of the care receiver. When you make your request, you are allowed to request a home in the language of the user, of the client. If there are times, though, when you're making an emergency request where you may not get your first choice and you do end up in a facility that is less than optimal and doesn't have people speaking the language. So the thing to do is, in the immediate, try and let the staff know as much as possible. If you can have English-speaking personnel come to them available. If at all possible, can you supplement? But for sure, to put that application to transfer to a home that provides services in English. More than that, it's a very tough one. You can go to your ombudsman, your complaint commissioner, the commissaire des plaintes. It's definitely, it's a human, it's a right to be serviced in the language of your choice. That's a tough one, I think, for all of us here who are English speaking.
I just want to say, I'm glad you mentioned the ombudsman. One of the roles that caregivers take on is advocating. And that's so important, all of us, to be able to advocate. This is just my personal view. If this would happen to me, I would be very vigilant and going to the ombudsman, calling up my representative in the government, because it's not only for me and my mom, it would be for all English-speaking individuals.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thanks, Lucy. All right, we have one more question in the chat. This is from one of our guests from Ontario, who is caring for her 88-year-old mother-in-law with 3 personal support worker visits and a day program twice a week. So this question is about the social worker. She was in contact with one through the Alzheimer's Society. And are you referring to the Alzheimer's Society social worker, or is there another social worker that they might have access to?
You know what, that depends on the public system. Generally, if you have a file opened in the public system, you will have a professional. It could be a nurse, it could be a social worker, depending on need. And there are also social workers who work in community organizations like Alzheimer's Society. So you might have more than one, but to understand your question better, it would be, I guess my question would be, for what purpose? Because if it's in terms of accessing public placement, generally you need a public social worker, not a social worker from one of the associations. That's more for support. I wish I was as familiar with the CCACs in Ontario, but both Lucy and I worked in Quebec system, so that's really where our expertise is. Does that answer your question? In the meanwhile, I have a story that I want to share, a personal one, and then I want to share the story of Lisa Raitt, which some of you might be familiar with, until we have another question in the chat. I just do want to go back to my former mother-in-law, who was so adamantly against nursing home placement. When she finally was admitted, within 3 months, she did startlingly better. Her routine was more structured. Her nutrition improved. It was amazing, and this doesn't always happen. I mean, we know sometimes the opposite happened, but in some cases, when it's the right time, a structured environment can really be actually better for a person suffering with dementia. So those of us caregivers who may feel like we struggle because we should keep them home at all costs, excuse me, there is the other side to it. And that's why I want to share Lisa Rate's story. Just very quickly, some of you might have seen this episode on W5. Lisa Rate, whom many of you probably know, is a politician, a Canadian politician. Sorry, I'm getting over the flu. She actually was a member of the Conservative Party, and really her future held, she could possibly have run for a prime minister. I think it was around 2016, her husband, at 56 years old, her husband Bruce, was diagnosed with early onset dementia, with BPSD, with the behavioral and psychological symptoms. She gave up her career and she was determined to care for him at home. I was at a fundraiser about 1 month ago for Alzheimer's disease, actually in Ottawa. She was a guest speaker there and gave an interview with her young son, who is now in her early 20s. And what was very interesting that she shared very honestly was that during the time, the last year when she kept her husband at home, he was aggressive. She was at risk. She put her sons at risk and wasn't even that aware of it because she was so overwhelmed by wanting to keep him home. And that when she finally did relocate him to a public nursing home with a special BPSD unit, he did so much better. So in the end, she did reveal that she felt she waited 1 year too long. And that's why I'm sharing this story. She wanted to share this story. You can find her interview on W5 on YouTube. It's very, very compelling.
Thanks, Joanne. So we have another question about bringing up the subject of a care home with someone's mom. So how would you recommend introducing the subject? Do you think it would be better to do that in the presence of a social worker?
Well, I think it all depends. It all depends on the cognitive level of the individual. I think it's so important to be able to share and to talk about it and to have a lot of different questions that you want to raise. If you feel that you need the support of someone else, a social worker, it's a good idea to bring them in. But again, keep in mind, does the person know the social worker? How will they react? It's important that they know who this person is, not to feel someone else is there, what's going on, I don't know anything about it, and now they're talking about a home care. So I think it all depends on who you're caring for, and to just kind of very slowly introduce the subject and see where it goes.
Thanks, Lucy. There's a couple of links in the chat just that might help people who are looking for specific information on assistance with language in Ontario. So thank you for sharing those links. And yeah, there's no other questions at the moment, but we did post the link to the episode that was requested that you had discussed earlier about the BP. Sorry, I don't remember the acronym. Behavioral.
BPSD.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. Yeah, it's such a process, like when we went back in the presentation and I went through the part of what's the process of applying for either private or public, the biggest process is the one you have to do with yourself and with the person you're taking care of. And I want to go back to that person who asked such a good question: when should I call the social worker? I couldn't agree more with you, Lucy. Right away, because you want to start thinking, reflecting, and understanding what's right for you. It's only when you start almost talking out loud about this that things will come into your head, considerations that you might not have thought of. So often with this disease, we have to react. Sometimes there's a crisis or a step down. So it's in times of plateau when we can really take the time to think, What does this mean for our lives? We just really encourage you to talk, to have those, what we call caring conversations. It's very, very important.
Well, we are always talking about that you don't need to do this alone. You don't. You don't need to do this alone. That's a big part of a social worker's role. And to have a case manager is really very, very important. And to share the things that are happening, because as the disease progresses, things will change. If there aren't any questions, or I'd like to share a little bit what happened with my situation, which was very different than most cases. So finally, my mother did accept to go to a care home, but I knew my mother. I wasn't quite so sure if she's going to remain there or not. So what I did was I decided to keep her subsidized apartment for a little bit longer, just to give her an opportunity. And having worked in the healthcare system for so many years and being in charge of some foster homes, I knew that it takes about between 6 to 8 months for a person to really start feeling comfortable in the environment. So sure enough, my mom went off, and she had a nice room with a nice roommate. And my mother lasted there exactly 2 days. And then all of a sudden, all hell broke loose. She wanted to come home. Now, I have to be very honest. I think it was my own guilt as being an only child. I should have maybe allowed her to have more of an opportunity to engage there. And it's hard for me to say this, but I'm sharing with you. I decided that I was going to take her back home. And I did. And that's when I realized that that she needed a lot more support. And I do have to say that the CLSC at the time, things are different now, or maybe not. Even though I was a professional, did research, and was counseling other caregivers, I needed a home care team, and I did get it. And for in my situation, it seemed to work out. So the unexpected, you should always but I had to recognize it was my own guilt of having placed my mother or put her into home care.
I think an important point too is for those people that have siblings, there is, and Joanne and Lucy are going to be covering this topic in January, on January 17th, actually at 11 a.m., how to deal with family conflict. But that is also could be an obstacle, when making the decision. If you as a family are not all on the same page, somebody mentioned earlier how, you may see that it's time to transition, but your siblings, they may say there's nothing wrong with mom or dad, or why are you forcing this? But so this is January 17th at 2 p.m. I'm corrected. But it's so important that as a family too, that you don't do this alone, that you get together, you discuss it. It does may cause a lot of frictions, especially if there are also finances involved, if you have to transfer to a private residence. But it's important that you really work together as a family and to minimize the conflict, because when the time comes to transition, if you're not on the same page, it'll make things even that much more difficult.
Thanks for sharing, ladies. We do have one more question. Is there a way to ethically transition a loved one to a long-term care or assisted living short of a crisis without their consent? Do we have an ethical responsibility to make a decision at some point to ensure that she is safe, especially given agnosognia? Thank you for sharing that term, as I've been describing this without knowing the term.
Anosognosia. It took me a while to be able to say it too.
Please go ahead.
To answer that question, I would go back again to your care team. And I really appreciate the fact that you brought this up as an ethical dilemma, because that's exactly what it is, an ethical dilemma. Most hospital centers and nursing homes have access to if they don't have ethicists. And sometimes it can be helpful to get somebody involved with you and to look at it. For somebody who is inept, who cannot make decisions, who is extremely distressed, sometimes that would be the recommendation that's in the best interest of everybody, is not to share the information if they cannot cope with it and it causes them mental distress. But, and there are processes to go through, ethical questions to ask that. And it's still heart-wrenching because I know this has come up several times during our hour. I think somebody else just added something in the chat. Could somebody read? I think it's a response to this.
Yes, absolutely. We faced this dilemma when we needed to take her car away, and we didn't want her to hurt herself or others on the road. Yeah, car keys. Yeah.
You know what? Somehow, I think when grave risks are involved, it's almost easier to make the decision, because when it's black and white that this is dangerous, it's dangerous for the person, it's dangerous for others, there's an imminent threat. It's almost like, okay, I can't. There's no way. It's when we're in that gray zone where we really do ask the questions, okay, the risk is there, but how strong is it? How strong is it to the person? And how can I, as a caregiver, how much do I have to sacrifice? How well am I? And I think, like Lucy, you talked a lot about guilt, and thank you for your vulnerability and your honesty. Sometimes we don't even want to be honest with ourselves because we need all our energy just to keep going. And if we pause, it's scary. If I pause and really question and ask myself, what am I going to come up with? But you owe it to yourselves to be honest with yourselves. It's your life and the person you're caring for. There are more than one of you in all these decisions.
Thank you, Joanne. We have another question about getting access to a social worker. So one of our guests is mentioning that the CLSC will only give her the name of the nurse in charge of the file. But I know you mentioned earlier that it might be a social worker or a nurse, so perhaps you can elaborate on that. And also wondering where she could get a list of residences that specialize in treating patients with dementia.
Mm-hmm. Two really good questions. So we start with the first one. It is a right and in the law that you have access to a professional of your choice. But that being said, there are, every organization has its limitations and the number and amount of resources they have and wait lists. And we know right now, post-pandemic, we are in a crisis of helping professionals. So probably the best thing you could do is work through your nurse and explain what you need a professional social worker for. So to try and at least get on the wait list for that professional. If that doesn't work, that's where I would turn to community organizations like Alzheimer's Association, depending again on where you live, to try and get some community-based social workers, support groups. It doesn't only have to be a social worker. It could be a psychologist. It could be another type of a social service helping professional. And there are also support groups. So, it's just a matter, and again, another burden for caregivers. So we know it's not easy and you have to have the strength for this. But yes, please hang in there, be persistent, and try to get access to the services that you need and deserve. There was a second question, sorry. I don't know if you have to repeat it.
Sure. Let me just scroll up. Meantime, we've been getting a lot of great comments from everyone who really appreciates having the opportunity to share with their, people who are going through the same type of situation. So lots of gratitude.
I think there was a part 2 to that first question. I just don't recall it.
It was a list of residences that specialize on patients with dementia.
Yes. I know just generally, again, go back to your public agency should be able to give you those lists and the ones that have specialty units. The other thing, again, if you're going private, you can try your private placement counselors. Maybe they have access to some of those lists. And today, a lot of these lists are online. So you can try going into your government resources and see what you can come up with by Googling and doing a little bit of research online. And I open it up to any other professionals here. If you know where you can access those lists beyond what I've said, please pipe in.
Or if they could maybe
Is there
just
anything
please,
on our website, on the website, Claire, on the dementia education? Website?
No, not
About that.
We don't. No. I think we have time for one more question. Diane, do you want to read it out loud?
Yeah. So the last question: how do you transition a parent who is in a nursing home? Whoops, sorry, I just jumped. Who is in a nursing home in Ontario, but the care team family soon will all be living in Montreal? Can you reach out to the CLSC before the person is even a resident in Quebec? So yeah, very good question, because sometimes you're not in the same province of the person you need to look after.
Yes, you can absolutely do that. We've done it many times. So you have your worker in Ontario get in touch with the receiving CLSC of Quebec. And usually the applications still have to be filled in and completed, but there's definitely a way to make an application from another province.
Thank you. If you have time for one final question, perhaps, do you recommend getting a regular psychologist? I'm finding caring for my husband quite different psychologically than with my mom. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on that?
The person is asking whether they themselves could benefit from having a therapist. If that's the question, definitely. And it goes back again that we all need help and support at certain times in our lives. And if it's a therapist, a psychologist, a social worker, you owe it to yourself to take care of you. And if you remember at the beginning, I said that the emotional part, the first thing that we need to do when we get all these feelings is to acknowledge them. And if you feel that you're overwhelmed, or if you feel that you're anxious or feel guilty or whatever it is, acknowledge it. You're allowed. It's okay. That's the first step of actually dealing with it. And having support, such as individual counseling, support groups, is extremely beneficial. So yes, I would highly recommend that you do this for yourself. It's a gift.
Well, thank you so much, Joanne and Lucy, for moderating today's talk, and for everybody who's here participating. I'd also like to once again thank the Petro-Canada Caremakers Foundation for supporting Caring Conversations. Joanne and Lucy will be hosting another very interesting topic on January 17th at 2 p.m. So please register on dealing with conflict among family members or other relatives. And if you would like to learn more about all the programs within the McGill Dementia Education Program, please go to mcgill.ca/dementia. We have an amazing companion book that's now been translated in over 7 different languages that is available for free for you to download, or you can purchase a hard copy on Amazon and support our program. It only costs $20. And please, since this is a pilot project, we would really like to hear from you. And so we will be sending you a short evaluation form. So please give us your thoughts and your feedback. We really hope that you found today's conversation very helpful. Once again, this is an initiative of the McGill University Dementia Education Program, which is funded by private donations. So, if you'd like to contribute to our program, we're always open to that. In the meantime, I'm wishing everybody a very healthy and happy holiday season. And we look forward to seeing you all once again in the new year. So thank you for participating today.
Take care, everybody. Happy holidays. Take care of you.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.